Our Bible word is Hebrews 8 verses 10. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, says the Lord, I will put my laws in their mind and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So, first, let's have a look at the context of Hebrews. The Epistle to the Hebrews. According to some early church sources, it was attributed to the Apostle Paul. For example, already from the 2nd century onwards, all of Paul's writings were collected together. And for some, this epistle was also added to this collection of Pauline epistles. But others in the early church also said they don't know who wrote this epistle. And for example, the early church father Origen, he said, but as to who actually wrote the epistle, God knows the truth of the matter. And that is quoted by Eusebius in his church history. So already in the early church there was question mark, who wrote this? And today scholars and theologians generally accept that Paul did not write this epistle, because the language is too different. The Greek grammar and style is too different. Also the theology is quite different if you compare it to Paul's epistles. So who wrote this? God knows who wrote this epistle. And also where he wrote it, for whom, we also do not know, because there's no real clues in the text. Maybe to people or Christians in Rome, because there's this reference to Rome towards the end of the epistle, etc. But exactly who wrote it and to where, which Christians this was aimed, we do not know. But what we can know is that it was aimed at Jewish Christians. And maybe it was written before the temple was destroyed, around 65 AD or so, because the author also writes as if the temple is still standing, the sacrificial system in the temple still operating, but it could also have been written quite after this, or after this time, after the temple was destroyed. So it was aimed at the Jewish Christian audience. And what we do know is that they were being persecuted, they were being harassed. And there are different phases that you can recognize in the epistle what this community has gone through. And the earliest phase is where they were persecuted, they were harassed, their property was plundered, but at this time they remained faithful. Not just to their Christian faith, but also to each other. And this we can go read in chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. If we go there, the author writes, but recall the former days in which after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you become companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. So yeah, the author writes to this earlier time period. He himself was in prison. They came to visit him also. And these Christians, their property was plundered. The city officials, whoever, turned a blind eye, and they were people around in the community, they were targets of abuse. And now, a little while later, this kind of harassment has continued, and it's difficult. And some started getting tired, and they started withdrawing from coming to Christian fellowship. And we can also read this in chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. Where the author writes there, let us consider one another. And in verse 25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another. So he says here, some are holding back, some are staying away from the Christian assemblies. And also some, they are still in prison, and it's becoming a burden to look after those in prison. Also in chapter 13, verses 3, the author writes about the present situation of believers. He says there, remember the prisoners as if chained with him, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. So even at the time of writing, there were those imprisoned. So it was a difficult situation. Yeah, people are losing their faith. They are withdrawing. There are those in prison. The community is still being harassed on a continual basis. So now our author writes this epistle. It's actually more like a sermon. It's actually more like a homily. He's giving them encouragement. If you go right to the end of the epistle, to chapter 13, verses 22, he writes about, receive this word of exhortation. So this is to encourage them, so that they don't withdraw from the faith, etc. So now he also addresses them. He says, now again I must instruct you. You've become like children. Now we must teach you again all the first principles. If you go to chapter 5, verses 12, from verses 12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. So the author also says, now it's like we're back at the beginning. You are withdrawing and you're losing your commitment to Christ. Now we must start from the beginning and teach you again. So that was a difficult situation. And also in chapter 11, for example, our author encourages these Christians. Remember the examples of the Old Testament. The patriarchs, those other figures he refers to. How they remained faithful to God. How they endured. Even though they did not receive the promise of rest that God has given to his people. So generally, this is a word of exhortation to Christians. Remain faithful. And the author also writes to convince these Christians Christ is superior to what they've known before. Do not go back to the Judaism that you knew. That is past now. The time of the new covenant has come. Christ is superior in several ways. And Christ is superior to the prophets, to the angels. He is superior to Moses, Israel's lawgiver. He is superior to Joshua. And Christ is also superior to the Aaronic priesthood and the whole Levitical sacrificial system. That was where people made or brought their sacrifices of atonement. That's where their sins were also removed through the priests who helped them with the sacrifices in the temple. But Christ is superior to this. Christ brought his once for all sacrifice. If we go read also in chapter 10, verses 10. By that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. In other words, Jesus, he made the sacrifice. So the work is done. No more sacrifices needs to be made. That's why Jesus is superior to this priesthood that operated in the temple. Also very important in the book of Hebrews is that it emphasizes the role of Jesus as the high priest. He replaces the old high priest. Jesus is now the mediator between God and the people. He is the one who offered himself. He brought his own body as a sacrifice of atonement. And because of that, he has become the high priest. Also the one who now is seated at God's right hand and who intercedes on behalf of God's people. So that's quite important. Jesus is superior to what these Jewish Christians have known before. And he is the high priest. He is now enthroned in heaven. He's seated at God's right hand, who now intercedes on behalf of God's people. Now let's focus on our textual unit, which is in chapter 8. And the author has argued now for the superiority of Christ's high priesthood. And if you look at the beginning portions of chapter 8, on screen you'll see there's the bottom half, which is the temple in Jerusalem. And the author argues that the temple there and the high priestly sacrifices and services taking place there were only temporary, actually a copy of the true temple. And so the top half of the screen our author, he generally argues for the superiority of the high priesthood of Christ. And why is Christ superior? Well, he is seated at the right hand of God, and he is a minister of the true heavenly temple, and he is the mediator of a better covenant that contains better promises. So this is why Christ, he is the superior high priest. And the author also brings this superiority of Christ now from chapter 8 onwards into relation to other things, in terms of what this means for the covenant, what this means for the temple, and what this means for sacrifice. And that we find from chapter 8 to chapter 10 verses 18. And now if we come to our immediate textual unit, and our immediate textual unit is there, chapter 8 verses 8 to 13, and it's that the old covenant is superseded. So of those three things our author writes about, now he focuses on the covenant, what Christ's superior high priesthood means for the covenant. And our author writes that the previous covenant did not work, it was not perfect. And he actually cites Jeremiah 31. And if we go to Hebrews 8, verses 9, from verse 8, he quotes as Jeremiah. He says, "Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they did not continue in my covenant," etc. So here the author, he cites Jeremiah, and Jeremiah was contrasting a new covenant that is coming, and it will not be the covenant that God made with the Israelites when they left the land of Egypt. So if we follow this chronologically, if we go back plus minus 1300 BC, there as God led the Israelites out of Egypt, he made a covenant with them. And we find that there in Exodus 24 verses 1 to 8. Especially if we focus on verses 7 to 8. There it says, "Then he took the book of the covenant," that's Moses, "and read in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, This is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you, according to all these words." Of course, we find here language very similar to that of Jesus. When he celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples, he said, "This is my blood of the new covenant." In other words, the sprinkling of his own blood initiates the new covenant also through his sacrificial death. But here, Moses made a covenant, and a covenant is like a contract. It's an agreement, so to speak, between God and his people. God expects obedience. You will obey my law. And if you obey my law, you will be blessed. You will have the land, and you will have many children, and you will have big crops in your agriculture, etc. And in addition to this covenant mentioned in Exodus 24, there was another one that we find in Deuteronomy. If you go to Deuteronomy 29 verses 1, there's also a covenant that is spoken of. So that's at the time of Moses, when he led the Israelites out of Egypt. Now let's move forward to the time of Jeremiah. If you go more or less to the year 621 BC, what happened there is that a scroll of the law was discovered by 𝐿𝐼𝐭, the high priest. And this probably refers to Deuteronomy, or an earlier version of Deuteronomy. And this inspired a covenant renewal by the king Josiah. He called all the people and the leaders of the people together, and they made an oath or a covenant renewal to God, because they discovered this book of Deuteronomy, and they said, no, we must do this, and we affirm this, what has been written there in Deuteronomy 29 verses 1. And you can read about that in 2 Kings 23. But despite this affirmation or covenant renewal by the king Josiah, Jeremiah recognized that this is not going to work. And Jeremiah speaks of a new covenant that will come. And this is what our current author of Hebrews, he writes plus minus 65 AD. This is what he refers to. He refers to the new covenant that was brought by Jesus. And he speaks also of the better covenant. If you read initially the early chapters of chapter 8. And this better covenant also contains better promises. So, what are these better promises that our author speaks about? And of course, he quotes from Jeremiah. Jeremiah 31 verses 32 to 34. And now we come to our Bible word. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law in their mind and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So that's the first better promise, where God says, I will put my law into their hearts. In other words, God's going to give a new nature to his people that will enable them to be obedient. So there's actually 3 of these better promises that Jeremiah contains, and that is also quoted by our author of Hebrews. Firstly, like I mentioned, this is the implanting of God's law in their hearts. That's where they will get a new nature and the ability to do it. The second better promise is personal knowledge of God. People will know God. They will experience him. They won't need to be reminded by God. Because it's also often said in the Old Testament that people forget God. They don't even know who he is. And the third better promise is that there will be a forgiveness of sins. So these are the better promises mentioned in verse 6. If we go to chapter 8 verse 6, let's just read it quickly. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry. Of course, this is Jesus, inasmuch as he is also a mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. So these are the better promises. The implanting of God's law in their hearts, personal knowledge of God, and also that there will be a forgiveness of sins. So this is how the superiority of Christ's high priesthood relates to the covenant. Christ has established the new covenant. He is the mediator of the new covenant. With this new covenant are better promises. And now in verse 13, our author also says, in that he says, a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So if our author wrote about 65 AD, this was close to the Roman or the Great War, and where the temple was eventually destroyed in 70 AD. So our author is arguing the new covenant has superseded the old covenant, and the old covenant is already on its way out. It's nearing its end, as it says here in verses 13. So this is about Jesus. He is the high priest par excellence. He's the minister of the new covenant, mediator of the new covenant. He ministers in the true temple, the heavenly temple, and this supersedes and replaces the old covenant.